The Broken Arrow Ranch sat like a skeleton in the Montana Badlands, its weathered fences casting long shadows across cracked earth. Where once green pastures stretched toward snow-capped mountains, now only rust-colored dirt remained, dotted with strange metal towers that hummed with unnatural energy. Thunder descended the rocky slope with measured steps, each hoofbeat echoing his memories of this place. The familiar scent of sage and mountain air was now tainted with something chemical, something wrong. His nostrils flared as he caught the acrid smell of ozone and heated metal drifting from those impossible towers that pierced the sky like accusing fingers. 20 years. He had counted every season, every migration, every harsh winter that had carved new lines into his weathered hide. But time had not dulled his memory of that final night. The night Charles Morrison had whispered urgent words into his ear before Thunder had been forced to flee into the wilderness. The white stallion paused behind a cluster of dead cottonwoods, studying the transformed landscape. The old red barn still stood, but its sides were now reinforced with steel plating. Armed guards patrolled between the metal towers, their movements precise and military. This was no longer a cattle ranch. This was something else entirely. A low whistle pierced the air, not the wind, but a signal. Thunder's ears swiveled as he tracked the sound to a figure crouched behind the ruins of what had once been Morrison's favorite thinking spot, a weathered bench overlooking the valley. The man was older now, his hair silver white, but Thunder would recognize that silhouette anywhere. Jake Brennan, Morrison's foreman, gestured carefully toward a gully that would provide cover. Thunder hesitated. Trust was a luxury he hadn't afforded anyone in 2 decades. But Jake had been there that last night, too. Jake had helped Thunder escape when the men in suits had first arrived. Moving like a ghost despite his size, Thunder picked his way down to the gully where Jake waited. The old cowboy's face was lined with years of worry, and his hands shook slightly as he reached out to touch Thunder's muzzle. "Lord Almighty," Jake whispered. "I never thought I'd see you again, boy. But you picked one hell of a time to come home." Thunder snorted softly, his breath visible in the cooling air. Through the gathering dusk, the metal towers pulsed with an increasingly intense blue light. "They've been expecting you," Jake continued, glancing nervously toward the ranch buildings. "Ever since the project started expanding last month, they've had sensors all through these hills. They know you're here." The stallion's ears flattened. 20 years ago, he had been just an extraordinary horse with an uncanny ability to understand human speech and emotion. But the wilderness had changed him, sharpened instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Now he could sense the electromagnetic pulse from those towers, feel it crawling across his skin like invisible spiders. "Morrison hid something before they got to him," Jake said urgently. "Something about Project Prometheus. He said if you ever came back, you'd know where to find it. Said you were there when he buried it." Thunder's memory flashed to that final night. Morrison had been frantic, digging behind the old water trough while helicopters circled overhead. He had pressed something wrapped in oilcloth into a metal box, whispering about insurance policies and the truth about the government's real interest in the ranch. A sharp crack echoed across the valley, the sound of a rifle being cocked. Both horse and man froze as spotlights blazed to life, turning night into harsh, artificial day. The metal towers began to emit a high-pitched whine that made Thunder's teeth ache. "Brennan!" A voice amplified by speakers boomed across the landscape. "Step away from the asset. You know the protocol." Men in tactical gear emerged from hidden positions surrounding the gully. Their weapons were strange, crackling with the same blue energy as the towers. Thunder had never seen anything like them, but every instinct screamed danger. Jake stood slowly, hands raised. 20 years you've kept me around, Garrison. 20 years I've kept my mouth shut about what really happened to Morrison. You promised me Thunder would be left alone if he never came back." A tall man in an expensive suit approached, his smile cold as winter wind. "Circumstances change, Brennan. The project has evolved beyond our original parameters. The asset possesses unique properties we now require." Thunder backed deeper into the gully. Muscles coiled. The electromagnetic pulse from the towers was growing stronger, and he could feel something responding to it, something inside him that hadn't been there 20 years ago. The wilderness had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Run, Thunder!" Jake shouted. "Find what Morrison hid. Tell the world what they—" The strange weapon discharged with a sound like tearing silk. Jake crumpled, his warning cut short. Thunder reared, his scream of rage echoing across the Montana Badlands as the net closed around him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Ghost picked his way through what had once been the northern pasture. 20 years had weathered the familiar landmarks beyond recognition, but muscle memory guided his hooves along paths that existed now only in his dreams. The sweet grass that had once carpeted these fields lay withered and sparse, replaced by patches of thorny scrub that seemed to drink the life from the soil itself. A metallic glint caught his eye near the old watering hole. Ghost approached cautiously, his nostrils flaring at an acrid scent that made his skin twitch with unease. Where clear spring water had once bubbled up from deep underground, now only a rust-colored trickle emerged, staining the cracked earth with streaks of orange and yellow. Strange barrels, their surfaces corroded and leaking, sat half-buried in the mud nearby. The stallion's ears swiveled forward as voices drifted across the wind. 2 men on horseback emerged from behind a rocky outcrop, their conversation carrying clearly in the still air. "Boss says we need to move the rest of them barrels before the inspector comes through again," the younger one was saying, his voice tight with nervous energy. "That government man's been asking too many questions about the water samples." His companion, a grizzled man with silver stubble and cold eyes, spat into the dirt. "Caldwell's got the inspector bought and paid for, same as half the territorial officials. Ain't nothing to worry about, boy. This operation's been running smooth for 3 years now." Ghost remained motionless behind a cluster of sagebrush, every instinct telling him to listen. These men wore no brands he recognized, and their horses bore saddles marked with an unfamiliar symbol, a coiled serpent wrapped around a mining pick. But what if someone finds out what really happened to old Sam Hartwell? The younger man pressed. People in town still talk about how he just up and disappeared right before. Hartwell knew too much for his own good. The older man cut him off sharply, kept poking around, asking questions about why his cattle were getting sick. "Some folks just can't mind their own business." He pulled out a pocket watch, its gold surface glinting. "Speaking of business, we best get moving. The next shipment arrives at sundown, and Caldwell wants everything ready." The men spurred their horses toward the ranch house, leaving Ghost alone with the poison spring and the weight of their words. Sam Hartwell. He remembered that name. A neighboring rancher, honest as the day was long, with a laugh that could be heard across 3 counties. If these men had done something to Sam, then whatever had taken root here ran deeper than simple neglect. As the dust settled from the rider's passage, Ghost noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Scattered among the rocks near the contaminated water were bleached bones, too many to be from natural causes, too varied in size to be from a single incident. Some bore the distinctive marks of cattle, others looked disturbingly like they might have come from horses. A few, partially buried and picked clean by scavengers, seemed altogether different in their proportion and shape. The wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound that made Ghost's ears pin back against his skull. From somewhere beyond the main compound came the rhythmic clanging of metal on metal, punctuated by the occasional rumble of heavy machinery. This was no cattle ranch anymore, if it had ever truly been one. Whatever Ezra Caldwell was running here, it had nothing to do with honest ranching and everything to do with the kind of enterprise that required poisoned water and missing neighbors. Ghost began moving toward the sound, keeping to the shadows and using every trick 20 years of wilderness survival had taught him. The terrain grew rougher as he approached the source of the noise, with new roads carved deep into the earth and strange mounds of excavated dirt piled high against the horizon. The very landscape seemed wounded, scarred by activities that had nothing to do with the natural rhythms of ranch life. A memory surfaced unbidden. The last conversation he'd had with Thomas Hartwell, Sam's younger brother, who had worked as the ranch foreman before Ghost's departure. Thomas had spoken of rumors, whispers of rich mineral deposits beneath the valley floor, of men from back east with deep pockets and shallow consciences looking to exploit whatever lay buried in the earth. At the time, it had seemed like idle gossip. Now, surrounded by the evidence of systematic destruction, those half-remembered warnings took on an ominous weight. The metallic clanging grew louder, accompanied now by voices shouting orders and the crack of whips. Whatever Operation Caldwell was running here, it was big enough to require a substantial workforce and ruthless enough to dispose of anyone who threatened its secrecy. Ghost's quest to reclaim his birthright had become something far more dangerous, a mission to uncover a conspiracy that had already claimed at least one life and showed no signs of stopping. The legendary White Stallion had returned home to find not just his past erased, but his future threatened by forces that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried as deep as whatever they were pulling from the tortured earth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corrupted landscape as Storm picked his way through what had once been the northern pasture. The earth felt wrong beneath his hooves, too soft in places, with an oily sheen that caught the light like a dark rainbow. He'd spent the night hidden in a grove of dying cottonwoods, watching the strange procession of men and machinery that never seemed to cease. Something glinted in the distance, and Storm's keen eyes focused on a lone figure moving deliberately through the wasteland. Unlike the others who scurried about their mysterious business, this one moved with purpose, pausing to examine the ground, occasionally kneeling to collect samples in small glass vials. The figure was a woman, Storm realized as she drew closer. Her graying hair was pulled back severely, and she wore clothes that marked her as an outsider, too clean, too purposeful for the rough men who seemed to run this operation. She carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, yet she moved with the caution of prey in predator territory. Storm remained motionless as she approached his hiding spot, every instinct screaming warnings. But something about her manner, the way she handled the corrupted soil with evident disgust rather than familiarity, stayed his flight response. The woman knelt barely 50 yards from his position, carefully scraping a sample of the tainted earth into another vial. As she worked, Storm caught fragments of her muttered observations carried on the wind. "Concentration increasing toward the eastern boundary," she was saying, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Deliberate contamination, no question." A distant shout made them both freeze. 3 riders were approaching at a gallop, and even from this distance, Storm could see the aggressive purpose in their approach. The woman quickly pocketed her vials and stood, but she made no move to flee. "Miss Caldwell!" the lead rider called out as they reined in their mounts in a cloud of dust. Storm recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, who'd been barely more than a boy when Storm had last seen this place. Now he was a hard-faced man with cold eyes and a deputy's badge that caught the morning light. "You're trespassing on private property." "I'm conducting a federal environmental survey, Deputy Morrison," the woman replied evenly. "I have all the necessary authorizations." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Your authorizations don't mean much out here. This is Blackwood Industries land now, and Mr. Crenshaw doesn't appreciate uninvited guests." Storm's blood chilled at the name. Silas Crenshaw, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness had preceded him even 20 years ago. If Crenshaw was behind this transformation, it explained much. "The contamination on this land extends far beyond your employer's boundaries," Caldwell said, her voice steady despite the menace radiating from the three men. "The water table beneath 3 counties is at risk." "That's a mighty serious accusation," Morrison said, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. "The kind that could get a person in trouble if they can't back it up." "Oh, I can back it up." Caldwell's chin lifted defiantly. "The question is whether you're going to let me finish my work, or if you are going to try to stop a federal investigator from doing her job." The tension stretched taut as a wire. Storm could smell the fierce sweat from the horses, could see the way Morrison's companions flanked out slightly, cutting off potential escape routes. These weren't lawmen, they were hired muscle with badges. Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Federal investigator or not, accidents happen out here. Long way from civilization. Easy for someone to get lost, fall down an old mine shaft, disappear entirely. "Is that a threat, Deputy?" "Just friendly advice about the dangers of wandering around unfamiliar territory." Storm had heard enough. Every fiber of his being rebelled against what this place had become, against the corruption that had poisoned not just the land, but the people who were supposed to protect it. He thought of old Samuel, of the promise he'd made, of the generations of horses who'd run free across these pastures. The white stallion stepped from the shadows. The effect was electric. The horses reared and whinnied in recognition of something primal and powerful. Morrison fought to control his mount, cursing as the animal spun in circles. The other 2 riders had their hands full keeping their seats as their horses tried to bolt. "What the hell?" Morrison shouted. Then his voice died as he got his first clear look at Storm. Even through the years of wandering, even with the dust of 100 trails in his coat, Storm was unmistakable. The stories had spread far beyond this valley. The ghost horse, the white devil, the stallion that no man could break or bind. "Impossible," Morrison breathed. Storm reared, his hooves flashing in the morning sun, his clarion call echoing across the poisoned landscape like a declaration of war. When he came down, his eyes locked with Morrison's, and in that gaze was a promise as old as the frontier itself. Some things could not be corrupted, some spirits could not be broken, and some homecomings were long overdue. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Samuel Morrison adjusted his worn leather satchel and climbed toward the heavy oak doors. 20 years of legal practice in territorial disputes had taught him to read the signs, and everything about Millfield Creek felt wrong. The telegram from his old friend Jake Thornton had been brief but urgent. "Need legal counsel. Ranch troubles. Come quick." Morrison had expected to find Jake dealing with water rights or boundary disputes, the usual conflicts that plagued ranchers in these parts. Instead, he'd arrived to find the Thornton spread abandoned, windows boarded, and neighbors who looked away when he mentioned Jake's name. The only lead came from old Mrs. Henley at the general store, who'd whispered about the courthouse records, before hurrying to serve another customer. Inside the courthouse, dust motes danced in shafts of light streaming through tall windows. The clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, barely looked up when Morrison requested the land records for the Thornton property. "Those files ain't available for public viewing," the clerk mumbled, not meeting Morrison's eyes. Morrison placed a silver dollar on the counter. "I'm representing interested parties in a legal matter. Surely the records are public domain." The clerk's hand hesitated over the coin before sliding it into his vest pocket. 10 minutes, that's all you get." He disappeared into a back room, returning with a thick folder that he dropped onto the counter with obvious reluctance. Morrison opened the file and felt his blood chill. The property transfers told a story that made his lawyer's instincts scream warnings. The Thornton Ranch had been seized for unpaid taxes, taxes that had mysteriously tripled overnight. The same pattern repeated across dozens of properties throughout the valley. Small ranches, family homesteads, even businesses in town all falling to the same impossible tax assessments. But it was the buyer's name that made Morrison's hands tremble. Blackwater Consortium, represented by one Ezra Blackwood. Morrison had heard whispers of Blackwood in territorial capitals and federal offices. A man who moved in shadows, acquiring land through legal maneuvers that skirted the edge of legitimacy. Railroad interests, mining claims, water rights. Blackwood's fingerprints appeared wherever valuable territory changed hands under suspicious circumstances. The clerk coughed nervously. "Time's up, mister." Morrison quickly transcribed the key details, his mind racing. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone had systematically targeted every independent rancher in the valley, using manufactured tax debts to force them off their land. The fact that it was all legal made it even more insidious. "Tell me," Morrison said as he closed the folder, "what happened to Jake Thornton?" The clerk's face went pale. "Don't know nothing about that. Man disappeared one night. That's all anyone knows." Morrison studied the man's expression and saw genuine fear. "When did you last see him?" "Week before the tax sale. He came in here fighting mad, demanding to see these same records. Said he was going to expose the whole thing." The clerk lowered his voice to barely a whisper. "Next morning, his horse came back to town alone, blood on the saddle." A chill ran down Morrison's spine. "The sheriff investigate?" The clerk let out a bitter laugh. "Sheriff Barnes? He's been real helpful to the new owners, if you catch my meaning. Found Jake's hat by the river and declared it an accident. Case closed." Morrison pocketed his notes and headed for the door, but the clerk's voice stopped him. "Mister, you seem like a decent man. Take some advice. Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't. Folks who ask too many questions about Blackwater tend to have accidents." Outside the courthouse, Morrison stood in the dusty street and surveyed the town with new eyes. Millfield Creek looked prosperous enough on the surface, but now he noticed the subtle signs. The way conversations stopped when strangers approached, the nervous glances toward the sheriff's office, the too quiet atmosphere that spoke of a community living in fear. He walked to the telegraph office and composed a careful message to his contacts in the territorial government. If Blackwood was operating here, there would be other lawyers, other investigators looking into his activities. Morrison had learned long ago that corruption on this scale required help to unravel. As he waited for the telegrapher to send his message, Morrison caught sight of movement in the hills beyond town. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a white horse silhouetted against the sky, watching the settlement below. Then it was gone, leaving him to wonder if the stress of his discoveries was making him see things. But something about that glimpse stirred a memory. Jake Thornton telling stories around campfires years ago, tales of a legendary white stallion that had once been the pride of these very lands. Morrison shook his head. Now wasn't the time for old legends. He had a conspiracy to unravel, and somewhere in these hills, the truth about Jake Thornton's disappearance was waiting to be discovered. The moon hung like a tarnished silver dollar against the star-scattered sky as Tempest moved through the shadows beyond the main house. His hooves found the soft earth between the scattered stones, each step deliberate and silent. The stallion had learned patience during his years in the wilderness, but tonight that patience warred with a growing urgency that prickled along his spine like lightning before a storm. Through the window of what had once been Samuel's study, amber light spilled across the ground in geometric patterns. Voices drifted on the night air, harsh, clipped tones that bore no resemblance to the warm conversations he remembered from this room. Tempest pressed closer to the building, his white coat ghostly against the weathered adobe walls. "The Railroad Commission is asking too many questions," a gravelly voice was saying. 3 more accidents in 2 months. They're starting to connect the dots. Let them ask." This voice belonged to the man Tempest had seen earlier, Garrett. "By the time they piece together enough evidence to matter, we'll own half the territory." The Transcontinental Express needs this route, and they'll pay whatever we demand once we control every water source from here to the Colorado. Tempest's ears swiveled forward. The Transcontinental Express. He'd heard whispers of it from travelers passing through the valleys where he'd roamed. A massive railway project that would span the continent, bringing unprecedented wealth to those who controlled the land it crossed. "What about the Martinez family?" asked a third voice, younger and nervous. "They're still refusing to sell. Old man Martinez says he'd rather die than give up his grandfather's land." A chair creaked, and Garrett's shadow moved across the window. "Then perhaps we should accommodate his wishes. Make it look like an accident. Bandits, maybe. This territory is still wild enough that people disappear." The stallion's muscles tensed. During his wandering years, he'd encountered the Martinez family numerous times. They were good people who had shown kindness to a lone horse seeking shelter during harsh winters. Their ranch lay in a valley rich with natural springs, exactly the kind of water source these men seemed intent on controlling. "That's the fourth family this year," the nervous voice continued. "People are starting to talk. Sheriff Morton's been asking questions about the pattern of accidents." Garrett's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Morton's been asking questions about a lot of things. Fortunately, his curiosity won't be a problem much longer. Tomorrow's ambush will see to that." Tempest's blood turned to ice. An ambush. Tomorrow. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place like stones in an avalanche, each revelation more disturbing than the last. These men weren't just stealing land. They were orchestrating a campaign of murder and intimidation that stretched across the entire territory. "The sheriff suspects the connection between the accidents and the railroad route," the gravelly voice added. "He's been gathering evidence, talking to survivors. If he reaches the territorial governor—" "He won't," Garrett interrupted. "Our friend in the governor's office has arranged for a convenient message to reach Morton. Something about urgent trouble at Widow's Canyon. The good sheriff has such a strong sense of duty. He'll ride out alone to investigate, just as we predict." Through the window, Tempest could see three men gathered around Samuel's old oak desk. Maps covered the surface, marked with red ink that looked like drops of blood in the lamplight. Garrett stood with his back to the window, but the stallion could see enough to recognize the man's expensive clothes and confident posture. This was someone accustomed to power, to having his orders obeyed without question. The other two men were clearly subordinates. The one with the gravelly voice was thick-set and scarred, a hired gun if Tempest had ever seen one. The nervous young man kept fidgeting with papers, his movements quick and jerky. All three wore the same brass pins on their lapels, a symbol Tempest didn't recognize but would remember. "What about the Indian reservation?" the scarred man asked. "The Apaches are getting restless about the water rights." "Chief Running Bear is old," Garrett replied dismissively. "His people depend on the trading post for supplies. Cut off their access to goods for a few weeks, and they'll sign whatever treaty we put in front of them. If not, well, there are other ways to handle savages." The casual cruelty in Garrett's voice made Tempest's hide crawl. This wasn't just about money or land. It was about absolute control, achieved through whatever means necessary. How many had already died for this conspiracy? How many more would follow? A sudden sound from the direction of the barn made all three men freeze. The nervous one moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Tempest melted back into the shadows, becoming one with the night itself. "Probably just the wind," the young man muttered, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Check it anyway," Garrett ordered. "We can't afford any witnesses, not with tomorrow's operation so close." The stallion heard boots moving toward the door and knew his time was running short. But he'd learned enough to understand the scope of what he faced. This conspiracy reached far beyond his beloved ranch, threatening everyone in the territory who stood in its way. The moon hung like a tarnished silver dollar above the mesa as Phantom descended through the shadows toward the cluster of buildings that had once been his sanctuary. 20 years had weathered his coat from pristine white to pearl grey, but his step remained sure, his instincts sharp as winter steel. The scent that reached his nostrils now carried none of the warmth he remembered. No hay sweetening in the barn, no wood smoke from Maria's kitchen chimney. Instead, an acrid chemical tang burned his throat, mingling with something else that made his skin crawl beneath his coat. Fear, human fear, thick as molasses and twice as dark. He'd spent the better part of 3 days watching from the ridge, learning the new rhythms of this corrupted place, where once cattle had grazed peacefully. Armed men now patrolled with rifles slung across their shoulders like promises of violence. The old bunkhouse windows glowed yellow through the night, but no songs drifted from within, only harsh voices speaking in clipped, urgent tones that carried across the desert air like the rattle of disturbed serpents. Phantom had seen enough frontier towns rise and fall to recognize the particular brand of evil that had taken root here. This wasn't simple banditry or cattle rustling. The men who'd claimed his ranch moved with military precision, their operations too coordinated, too well-funded for common outlaws. Whatever they were manufacturing in those converted barns required secrecy worth killing for. He'd confirmed that dark truth 2 nights prior when a rider had approached from the south, a young Mexican man whose horse bore the distinctive brand of the Valdez Ranch 30 miles downriver. Phantom had watched through the pre-dawn darkness as the stranger was escorted into the main house. An hour later, the same men dragged out a body wrapped in canvas, loading it onto a wagon that disappeared into the desert before sunrise. The rider's horse still stood in the corral, whinnying plaintively for a master who would never return. Now, as Phantom picked his way through the scrub oak and boulder fields that flanked the ranch's northern approach, every fiber of his being screamed warnings. But somewhere in those buildings, answers waited. And perhaps, though he barely dared hope, some trace of the family who had loved him remained. The first building he reached was the old chicken coop, long since converted to what appeared to be a storage facility. Wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling bore markings in a language Phantom didn't recognize, but the symbols were precise, official-looking. Government stamps, perhaps, or military designations. He pressed his muzzle against a gap in the wooden slats and inhaled deeply. Gunpowder, enough to level half the territory. A boot scuffed against gravel somewhere behind him, and Phantom melted into the shadows between the building and a rusted water trough. The guard who rounded the corner moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd walked this route 100 times before, rifle cradled loosely in his arms. He was young, maybe 25, with the soft look of a man who'd never faced real hardship. City-bred, Phantom judged, probably sent west by whoever was running this operation to keep the locals in line. The guard paused not 10 feet from where Phantom stood motionless, fishing in his shirt pocket for tobacco. In the flare of his match, Phantom caught sight of a tattoo on the man's wrist, an eagle clutching arrows, surrounded by words too small to read in the brief light. Military ink, or something meant to look like it. As the guard continued his circuit, Phantom slipped around the building's far corner and approached the main house. Here, the changes struck him like physical blows. The wraparound porch where old Samuel used to sit whittling had been enclosed with heavy wooden planks, gun slits cut at regular intervals. The flower boxes Maria had tended so carefully were gone, replaced by coils of barbed wire. Even the front door had been reinforced with iron bands and fitted with multiple locks. But it was the smell drifting from the cellar that made Phantom's blood run cold. Death, recent death, and lots of it. He was contemplating how to reach the cellar windows when voices erupted from inside the house. Not the casual conversation of men at ease, but sharp, angry exchanges that spoke of plans gone wrong and patience wearing thin. A chair scraped across floorboards, followed by the heavy tread of boots on stairs. The front door burst open, spilling yellow lamplight across the yard. 3 men emerged, the leader a tall figure in a black coat who moved with the predatory grace of a born killer. Even in the dim light, Phantom could see this was no common desperado. The man's clothes were too fine, his bearing too assured. This was someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "Send word to Denver," the man was saying as the trio descended the porch steps. "Tell them we're moving up the timeline. If Washington is getting suspicious, we need to complete the transfer before—" A cloud passed over the moon, plunging the yard into darkness, and when the light returned, the men had vanished into the maze of outbuildings, their conversation lost to the desert wind. But Phantom had heard enough. Whatever conspiracy had consumed his home reached far beyond the boundaries of any ranch. The moon hung like a tarnished silver dollar above the mesa as thunder crested the ridge overlooking the Blackwater Mining Company's main operation. What spread below him defied everything he thought he understood about this corruption of his homeland. The excavation stretched for miles, carved deep into the earth like a festering wound, but this was no ordinary mining operation. Massive wooden structures rose from the pit's depths, their purposes unclear in the pale moonlight. Steam hissed from copper pipes that snaked between buildings, and the acrid smell of chemicals burned his nostrils. Workers moved like ants through the complex, their lanterns creating a constellation of amber dots in the darkness. But it was the sound that made Thunder's blood run cold, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo from the very bowels of the earth itself. Sarah's voice drifted up from a cluster of buildings near the pit's edge. Thunder picked his way down the treacherous slope, his hooves finding purchase on loose shale and jutting rocks. The closer he drew, the more the wrongness of this place pressed against him like a physical weight. Through a grimy window, he glimpsed Sarah seated across from a man whose back was turned to the glass. The stranger wore an expensive suit that seemed obscenely out of place in this wilderness hellscape. His silver hair was slicked back, and when he gestured, Thunder caught the glint of gold rings adorning his fingers. "The operation proceeds on schedule," the man was saying, his voice carrying the crisp accent of Eastern money. "Senator Morrison has ensured the territorial surveys will overlook our activities for another 6 months. By then, we'll have extracted what we need." Sarah leaned forward, her weathered face tense. "And the people asking questions? The families whose wells have gone dry?" "Acceptable losses." The man's casual dismissal made Thunder's ears flatten against his skull. "Progress demands sacrifice, Miss Hartwell. The techniques we're perfecting here will revolutionize extraction across the entire frontier. A few displaced ranchers are insignificant compared to the wealth we're unlocking." Thunder circled the building, searching for another vantage point. Through a side window, he saw maps covering an entire wall, not just of the local territory, but stretching across multiple states and territories. Red pins marked dozens of locations, each connected by strings to newspaper clippings and official-looking documents. "The mercury amalgamation process is yielding beyond our projections," Sarah continued, though her voice carried an undercurrent Thunder had never heard before. Doubt, perhaps even fear. "But the runoff is affecting the groundwater faster than anticipated. The contamination is spreading." The silver-haired man stood and moved to the map wall, and Thunder finally saw his face. Angular features spoke of European aristocracy, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. Dr. Cornelius Ashford's research proved invaluable. His chemical innovations have increased our yield by 300% over traditional methods. Thunder's mind reeled. Dr. Ashford. He remembered that name from conversations between Sarah and her father decades ago. A government scientist who had visited the ranch, studying soil composition and water tables. But this man spoke of him as if he were part of their conspiracy. "The side effects on the local ecosystem weren't part of our agreement," Sarah said, standing abruptly. "The wildlife is dying, Pemberton. The streams run black and the air itself is becoming poison. Pemberton. Thunder filed the name away as the man turned back to Sarah with a thin smile. You've developed an inconvenient conscience, my dear. Might I remind you that your debts to our organization extend far beyond monetary considerations? Your father's research, your family's legacy, all of it belongs to us now. My father never intended his work to be used like this, Sarah shot back, but her voice wavered. Your father was a brilliant but naive man who failed to understand the true potential of his discoveries. The mineral extraction techniques he pioneered, combined with Ashford's chemical processes, have opened possibilities he never dreamed of. We're not just mining silver and gold, Miss Hartwell. We're perfecting methods that will strip entire mountain ranges bare in a fraction of the time previously required. Thunder backed away from the window as the full scope of the conspiracy crystallized in his mind. This wasn't just about his ranch or even this territory. These people were using his homeland as a testing ground for techniques they planned to spread across the frontier, leaving poisoned earth and dead rivers in their wake. A sound behind him made Thunder spin around. 3 armed men emerged from the shadows between the buildings, their rifles trained on him. In the lead stood the scarred foreman from earlier, his twisted grin visible even in the moonlight. "Well, well," the man drawled. "Looks like our ghost horse ain't so smart after all. Mr. Pemberton's been expecting you, old friend. Time you learned what happens to legends that outlive their welcome." Thunder's muscles coiled as he calculated distances and escape routes. The men spread out, clearly experienced in capturing wild horses. But they had no idea what 20 years of survival had taught him about being dangerous. The midnight air carried whispers of conspiracy as Silverwind pressed his powerful frame against the weathered boards of the old grain silo. 20 years of wandering had taught him patience, but tonight urgency coursed through his veins like wildfire. The documents Martha had shown him revealed only the surface of something far more sinister than cattle rustling or land grabbing. Through a crack in the wooden slats, he watched men in expensive suits gather around a table lit by oil lamps. These weren't the rough cowboys he remembered from his youth, nor the simple homesteaders who once worked this land. These men spoke in clipped Eastern accents about shipments, routes, and territories that stretched far beyond the boundaries of any ranch. "The operation in Colorado has exceeded expectations," one man said, unrolling a map across the table. "But we need to expand the southern corridor before the railroad companies catch wind of what we're doing." Silverwind's ears twitched. Railroad companies. That explained the strange tracks he'd noticed crisscrossing the property, not for cattle cars, but for something else entirely. The white stallion shifted his weight, trying to get a better view of the map, when a familiar voice froze his blood. 20 years I've been building this network," said Judge Harrison, stepping into the lamplight. "I didn't orchestrate the destruction of the McAllister family just to have some railroad barons muscle in on our territory now." The words hit Silverwind like a physical blow. Judge Harrison, the man who had presided over the legal proceedings that had supposedly legitimized the ranch's sale after the mysterious fire that killed the McAllister family. The same fire that had scattered the horses and sent Silverwind fleeing into the wilderness. "The beauty of it," Harrison continued, "is that everyone still thinks this is about cattle and land disputes. They have no idea we're running the largest opium distribution network west of the Mississippi." Opium. The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. The strange, sweet smell that had puzzled him since his return wasn't from exotic flowers, it was from poppy processing. The modified barns weren't for livestock, but for refining and storing drugs. The network of trails and hidden tracks formed a distribution system that reached from the ports of California to the growing cities of the East. "What about the old-timers in town?" asked another man. "That newspaper woman's been asking questions, and Sheriff Coleman's starting to sniff around." Harrison's laugh was cold as winter wind. Martha Henley won't be a problem much longer. As for Coleman, he's an honest fool, but he's also predictable. A few more mysterious accidents, and the whole town will be too frightened to ask questions. Silverwind's muscles tensed. Martha was in danger, and probably Sheriff Coleman too. But before he could move, footsteps crunched in the gravel behind him. A rough hand grabbed his halter, and he found himself staring into the scarred face of Buck Morrison, Harrison's foreman. "Well, well," Morrison drawled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look what we got here. The legendary white stallion, back from the dead." The foreman's recognition sent a chill through Silverwind. Morrison had been here 20 years ago, had probably helped orchestrate the fire that destroyed everything Silverwind had once called home. "You know," Morrison continued, keeping his voice low so the men inside wouldn't hear, "the judge always regretted not finishing the job properly back then. Said leaving witnesses, even four-legged ones, was sloppy." Inside the silo, the meeting was breaking up. Silverwind could hear chairs scraping and papers rustling as the conspirators prepared to disperse. If Morrison raised an alarm now, any chance of exposing the truth would vanish like smoke. The stallion made his choice. With explosive power, he reared up, his iron-shod hooves catching Morrison across the chest and sending the man sprawling unconscious into a pile of grain sacks. But the commotion had been heard inside. "What was that?" Harrison's sharp voice cut through the night. "Just checking, sir," Morrison called out weakly, struggling to his feet. Blood trickled from his mouth, and his eyes promised future retribution, but he kept silent about Silverwind's presence. As the conspirators filed out of the silo, scattering to various buildings across the ranch, Silverwind melted back into the shadows. He had what he needed: the truth about the fire, about the McAllister family's murder, about the vast criminal network that had grown like poison across the land he had once called home. But truth without proof meant nothing. Martha would need evidence, and Sheriff Coleman would need more than the word of a horse to bring down a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The white stallion began moving through the darkness, his mind racing with plans as desperate as they were dangerous. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and this time there would be no running away. The ghosts of the McAllister family, the future of Martha and Coleman, and the soul of the land itself all depended on what happened in the next 24 hours. The legend would either end where it began or rise from the ashes stronger than ever. The first rays of dawn painted the horizon crimson as Tempest stood atop the ridge, his white coat gleaming like polished silver against the morning sky. Below him, the Broken Arrow Ranch spread out in all its corrupted glory, the steel towers humming with their sinister purpose, the underground laboratory hidden beneath innocent-looking barns, and the armed guards patrolling what had once been open pastures where he'd run free as a colt. Sarah Martinez emerged from the main house, her federal marshal's badge catching the early light. Behind her came Sheriff Tom Bradley, the man who'd spent 20 years believing the official story about Marcus Whitfield's death, only to discover that his own deputy had been part of the conspiracy all along. They moved with purpose toward the communications tower, carrying enough evidence to expose the entire operation. Tempest's nostrils flared as he caught a familiar scent on the wind: tobacco and leather, the same combination that had clung to the men who'd murdered Marcus Whitfield 2 decades ago. Vincent Cross stepped out of the shadows near the main gate, flanked by his private security team. The stallion's eyes narrowed as he recognized the man's weathered face, older now but unmistakably the same gunman who'd pulled the trigger that terrible night. "You're too late, Marshal," Cross called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "The final shipment leaves in an hour. By the time your federal friends arrive, there won't be anything left to find." Sarah raised her weapon, but Cross's men already had her and Bradley surrounded. The conspiracy that had taken root here went deeper than anyone had imagined. Not just illegal weapons trafficking, but a sophisticated network that had been using the remote ranch as a hub for moving contraband across 3 states. The Nexus Corporation's legitimate mining operations provided perfect cover for their underground activities. Tempest began his descent down the rocky slope, his hooves finding purchase on the treacherous terrain with the sure-footedness that had made him legendary. He'd spent 20 years wandering the wilderness, but every trail had ultimately led him back here, to this moment of reckoning. In the laboratory beneath the barn, Dr. Elena Vasquez frantically destroyed files and hard drives. She'd never intended for her research to be weaponized, but Cross and his employers had made it clear that her cooperation wasn't optional. The innovative tracking technology she'd developed for wildlife conservation had been perverted into something far more sinister, a surveillance network that could monitor and control vast stretches of territory. The stallion reached the valley floor as the first gunshots rang out. Sarah had taken cover behind a water trough, returning fire, while Bradley circled around to flank Cross's position. But they were outnumbered, and more armed men were emerging from the buildings. Tempest charged. His thundering hooves sent dust clouds swirling as he galloped toward the compound, 20 years of wandering and waiting culminating in this moment of fury. Cross turned at the sound, his eyes widening in disbelief as the legendary white stallion bore down on him like an avenging spirit. "Impossible," Cross breathed, raising his weapon. "You should be dead." The bullet went wide as Tempest crashed into the man who'd killed his beloved Marcus. Cross flew backward, his gun spinning away across the dirt. The stallion reared up, his hooves striking the air above the fallen gunman's head. Not to kill, but to pin him down while justice took its course. Sarah sprinted forward, her handcuffs ready. Around the compound, Cross's men were surrendering as the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. The federal task force had arrived right on schedule, guided by the GPS coordinates Sarah had transmitted before the shooting started. Dr. Vasquez emerged from the barn with her hands raised, a hard drive clutched to her chest. "I kept copies," she called out. "Evidence of everything they made me do. The real research, the weapons modifications, all of it." As the dust settled and the prisoners were secured, Tempest walked slowly toward the old oak tree, where Marcus Whitfield's grave lay hidden beneath years of neglect. Sheriff Bradley followed, his hat in his hands. "I should have investigated deeper back then," Bradley said quietly. "Should have questioned the official story when a good man like Marcus supposedly just disappeared." The stallion lowered his great head, his breath stirring the wildflowers that had grown over the unmarked grave. Justice had finally come to the Broken Arrow Ranch, but it couldn't bring back the gentle rancher who'd once brushed Tempest's coat and whispered dreams of running free across endless plains. Sarah approached, her voice soft with understanding. "The land will be returned to the state for preservation. No more towers, no more laboratories. Just open range, the way it was meant to be." Tempest raised his head to gaze across the valley, seeing not the corruption that had festered here, but the pristine wilderness it would become again. His long journey was finally complete. Marcus could rest in peace, and the land he'd loved would heal. The legendary white stallion turned toward the distant mountains, his hoofbeats writing the final chapter of a story that had begun with murder and ended with justice restored.